so much to all four of you for those fascinating insights, but also really thoughtful views as well on some of those issues. I think you know, listening to all of you speak, one of the things that stood out to me was that, you know, Sarah, you talked about the fact that that the rules-based system has been so entrenched in the way that we do business, and to a certain extent our political operating as well, and that's perhaps been taken a little bit for granted over the years. I mean, I certainly remember a time where actually trade was never in the media, it was never discussed. That's certainly not like that now, but you know, getting a journalist in New Zealand, and maybe it was the same in the US, to write an article about trade policy was nigh on impossible, and so perhaps that's you know, the mistake of the business community and assuming that that we could trust in that system, but also the political system as well. I guess before I hand it over, I might take the luxury of asking the first question, and I guess flowing on from that, I was somewhat heartened to a certain extent that the rules-based system is so entrenched in the way that we operate, that for me, hopefully that also means that it will continue on. But I guess my naivety slightly was that this narrative, as you put it, Jennifer, really was driven by this administration. And I guess, you know, hearing from, you know, from particularly yourself, Joe, and you, Penny, you know, these are concerns that have actually been around for a really long time. So I guess my first question, maybe to start the conversation, is to what extent is this narrative entrenched in US thinking, and will it go away with the change in president? Because it doesn't sound like it will. And maybe after you provide your thoughts, Jennifer, you know, whether the other panellists think that that actually, even if this issue did go away with President Trump, whether actually we've got to do something, you know, as members of the WTO. Jennifer.
Yeah, well, I would say that your question sort of, and I think the comments from a number of the panelists make the point. The U.S.'s concerns with the appellate body did not start with Donald Trump, and they will not end with Donald Trump. So I think the substance of the concerns has been there for quite a long time. And I think as you're hearing, some of the frustration is that the U.S. has been saying these things for more than 10 years and feels they've been ignored. So I think that's the truth of it. But what is different about the Trump administration is the tactic. The notion that you will simply block any discussion, any consideration, any possibility to appoint new appellate body members, and you will not engage in any of the discussions for reforms to fix the very issues that you're complaining about. That is definitely new. And the third thing that's clearly new about the Trump administration is the willingness to engage, to actually engage in a lot of unilateral, illegal behavior in a way that is very dismissive of the WTO and the WTO rules. So those things are new. And at least it would be my hope that this idea that you can engage in illegal unilateral behavior is something that will die with the Trump administration. But the concerns about the appellate body and the need for reform of the WTO system more broadly, I think are more longstanding, and I think they're shared by a fair number of other countries, even if no one shares the tactical approach of this unilateral destructiveness that the Trump administration path is on.
Thank you. Did any of you have?
Only from my perspective, I totally agree with Jennifer. I mean, these are long-standing issues. The tactics are different. That might mean that there's a change in approach in the future. I mean, I think it's important, irrespective of the situation, that members push for reform. And there's different ways in which that reform can be pushed. It can be pushed through actual amendments to the dispute settlement understanding, which are going to be much more difficult, but there's also a way in which members could, through guidelines, assist in ameliorating behaviour, getting greater discussion going between members in the appellate body, but also, and I think this is also really important, is leading by example. Actually having a good approach themselves. I mean, it's always really difficult when you're faced with difficult tactical approach of a member. You actually tend to actually get involved in that same tactical approach, and that's actually members should stand above that and lead by example and self-restraint and trust. Again, trust the system. The rules-based system is of benefit to countries like New Zealand, and we should maintain that from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a need for reform regardless of what happens in the leadership in the United States. I think there's probably an appetite for that amongst broadly amongst the WTO members as well. The way in which we trade is changing and has changed. The digital economy, investment, which isn't really disciplined by the WTO in a significant way. The way in which the world is going to work and what the future of work is going to look like and how the WTO remains relevant to that. I think largely in the past, the WTO and big members were prepared to accept outcomes at the dispute level if they were roughly getting it right, and you used to hear this phrase a lot. The rules are kind of like guideposts, which is what Sarah spoke to, whether you use them or not. They sit out there as a sort of framework under which to operate, whether you actively engage in them or not, and having them there, acting in that role is really important, but they have to be relevant, and people have to believe that they're relevant to what's going on in the world in order for them to stand up. So I think, yeah, there is appetite for it going forward, and I think there has to be change. The problem for me right now, and I guess for many, is that the US is not engaging. It's very much in listening mode, and there are dangers in that. It doesn't mean you should sit back and do nothing, but the dangers in that is that you start negotiating with yourselves, you start negotiating in a way that's not meaningful. You might come up with options that ultimately aren't meaningful. You still have to do it, but ultimately there's a danger in that. And what might change with a change in leadership is the way in which a big member is prepared to engage in these challenging discussions that are highly emotive at their core.
Thank you. Well, so can I open it to the floor then? Daniel?
Could I just follow up on that general topic with what Penny was saying at the end, sort of in panels we trust idea. If this is just a tactic, isn't there a risk that it's a tactic that once it's been played, it's never going to disappear? So it might be that the US gets over its concerns, but now this is something that it is permissible, possible, contemplatable to do. That if you don't like your decision, then until we get a functioning appellate body, again assuming that we pass December and nothing gets fixed, then one answer is just to appeal. But even beyond that, another answer is just to try and block new appellate body members if you don't like what's happening. So have we sort of broken the rules-based system, whether we can fix it with band-aids at the end of the year or not?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. And I don't think, I totally accept everything that you say. I mean, I think that if the selection of appellate body members continues to be blocked, and if you can block, the acceptance of a panel report by simply putting in a notice of appeal, then in effect what you've done is reverted to the GATT system, which is a veto. I think it's not all bad. The GATT system did work. It did not work for highly political cases. So, for example, there is now a panel report out on the national security exception, which the US does not accept the interpretation of that, point blank. It, in all likelihood, if it has the opportunity, it would block any any acceptance of a panel report which dealt with the national security exception in the same way in the future in a case that we're attempted to use that exception. So yes, there are some things which are so highly political that they will never be resolved. You know, if there is, if the current situation sort of continues into the future. But I don't think the whole system is broken. I think this is where we differ, because I think the system, at its core, it's not broken, because why are so many countries using it even more? The system is still there, and I think if we put this much trust in the system, and if members exercise self-restraint, the normal types of, you know, resolution of disputes can still take place, and I guess that's my optimistic bent.
So Jennifer, I saw you nodding, and hopefully you could actually hear that question. Did you have anything to add?
Unfortunately, the sound kind of went in and out, so maybe just a quick repeat of the question if you could. That would help me.
So,
so can you hear what I'm saying now?
Yes, I can, but the sound kind of comes in and out is the problem.
So really briefly, the question was, once this tactic's been played, has the system radically changed whether or not we can fix up the US's concerns now? Because doesn't it mean that there'll be other countries that will want to play this tactic later? And doesn't that mean that the WTO system is now sort of subject to sabotage at the will of one of the big playground bullies?
I guess I think the answer is probably not, because I'm gonna agree with the notion that fundamentally I think the panel system is working. And if you think about it, right now you've got a lot of these challenges pending right now to the US's unilateral tariffs. So there's 9 cases pending challenging the US's tariffs on steel and aluminum. These are the ones that were put on the grounds of national security. And then China has now brought, I think, 3 or 4 separate panels complaining about the tariffs that the United States has put on under this Section 301, complaining about China's intellectual property and technology transfer issues. Again, the system is working in the sense that I think those challenges right now, there's panels that are in existence that have been formed, you know, and my own view is those panels are going to rule unequivocally against the United States, because what the United States is doing is breaking the rules. I mean, on the steel and the aluminum it's very straightforward. You're not allowed to put on tariffs above your binding rates. What is the United States' bound rate on steel? 0. So when you turn around and put a 25% tariff on, it's a clear violation of that. And we've imposed the tariffs on some but not all countries. So Australia, for reasons nobody knows, is out from under the steel and the aluminum tariffs. I won't comment on the rumors that it's Greg Norman playing golf with the president, but in any event, Australia is out. South Korea, Brazil, and Argentina have quotas rather than tariffs, but they're not having the tariffs applied to them, so that's an MFN violation. So I think a panel is clearly going to say, no, United States, you cannot do this consistently with the WTO rules. And I would say similarly for China's challenge against the tariffs. Now, at the same time, everybody else in the world has put retaliatory tariffs against the United States, and the U.S. has challenged those. And again, I think those are going to be hard for countries to defend. So I think you will get panel reports that are going to say, wait a minute here, everybody, you have to obey the rules. I don't think there's going to be this sense that the United States just gets away with it. You know, and then part of it depends on how the domestic politics in the United States will work out. It is pretty clear, notwithstanding the President Trump's tweets, even yesterday, the tweet that somehow, you know, China is paying all of these tariffs, the American people understand that when the president decides to put these unilateral tariffs on, it is the American people that are paying the tariffs, and it's American consumers that are paying the tariffs, and it's our farmers that are hurting more than anybody else as a result of the tariffs. So I think the combination of the rules-based system actually having panels come to play, and the politics of the fact that this unilateral tariffs is not working, and you add on top of it that the idea of unilateral tariffs, my argument would be they've never worked. But if you argue that they worked some back time in place, They don't work when you have global supply chains. They simply do not work. In the instance in which the vast majority of components of anything made in the United States or elsewhere were imported components, or that the goods have crossed the border on average, as autos do in the United States, more than 14 times before that car is finished, you cannot do this unilateral tariff business where nobody has any predictability, nobody has any security, and continue to operate with global supply chains. And I think there's no chance that the global supply chains completely unwind. So I think it's a combination of the rules plus the actual reality of how trade takes place today that will mean that the United States will not come out of this as a big winner for having engaged in all of this unilateral behavior. I think it's going to become pretty clear that this is a losing strategy, and I think that will also act as a discipline on whether other countries want to follow the United States down this road. It's not a happy road to be on, and I would assume other countries will look at that and say, I don't want to go down this road either.
Can I just say something? If your question is also about the appointments of appellate body members and blocking people to the appellate body, there's always been a highly politicised process. So really the only guidance is that the appellate body membership should be broadly representative of the membership. And there's always been that threat hanging out there that some member would not agree to, and because it has to be effectively by consensus, that some member would not agree to the appointment of the appellate body. So that threat's always been there. It's just never been exercised before in the way that the United States is doing it. Because most members thought that ultimately nobody would do that because of the threat to the system and the earthquake effectively that would create. From a New Zealand perspective, just coming back to the panel point, I think one of the things that we are really concerned about is to make sure that we preserve the reverse consensus rule. That means that you would still have at the panel level, if that's what happened, the adoption of appellate body reports. That you wouldn't be able to have a system in place that meant that you would kind of have a de facto return to the GATT. Whether we're successful in that, how things play out, I have no idea, but it's certainly of great interest to New Zealand that what was negotiated, a reverse consensus rule, that means it gets adopted unless everybody says that it shouldn't, that we preserve that.
We have time for perhaps one or two questions.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, of course.
Hi Jennifer, Tim Grosser. Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to hear your voice. Oh, now I see you as well. Great to see you as well.
I just want to make a sort of a general comment or two about the situation. First of all, I think David's report has got as close to zero chance of being acted on in the foreseeable future because the solution lies in much broader political circles than what can be agreed amongst ambassadors and chief negotiators in Geneva. This does not make it wrong to have done that. It will, because the solutions, as Jennifer said in her opening comments, are actually quite technical. They're not all that challenging to find different ways of fixing it. And even on zeroing, frankly, in the greater scheme of things, the Japanese just simply relaxed their position on something that isn't the meaning of life. You could even fix that problem. The bigger problem, however, is there is systemic, huge challenges to the entire system. And I think if you look back at Jennifer's explanation as to how on earth it was politically possible in 1995 to get a binding arbitration system through, given the history of the United States on the issues along the lines that Jennifer was outlining, the solution will also have to respect that broader political reality. So what I think we're going through now is a long period of learning some very brutal lessons. Number one lesson is that it has always been a fallacy that the system of rules exists only really for the smaller and medium-sized players. Big countries don't need it. This is complete bullshit. The reality is, and I could quote you case after case after case, is that without a framework of stable rules, the great powers themselves find it very difficult to equilibrate their economic relationships in a lasting way. Yes, once there's 25% tweet threat has come and gone, and the greatest trade deal is announced in about a month's time. But that's not the end of China-US hostility on trade without a framework. This will go on and be repeated. And given the evolution of global supply chains, for example, about 50% of American imports are intermediate goods, is the whole system needs stability. So we've gone along like children brought up in Bible class, repeating the catechism, endless words, without really truly understanding the vast human history behind these words, of talking about the need for security, stable frameworks. But we've had them operating reasonably well for so long that people have actually forgotten what it was like to operate in the absence of that. And you're absolutely right, Sarah, because if that was the world I came into trade policy, where actually there's no country in the world, developed world, that has got a clear historical and recent experience of living without rules, given the fact that there were no operationally effective rules on agriculture, and that was what New Zealand did. We had to live in the jungle until the Uruguay run, so we know from experience what this means. So I think David's report will hit town. I'm sure it's an excellent report. It'll gather dust temporarily. The biggest solution lies in far broader political and economic developments. And you can bet your bottom dollar that if he extends the national security tariffs to auto and auto parts to Europe, there will be a goddamn massive retaliation against the United States. And this whole system could come up to a very different conclusion quite rapidly.
Yeah, and I think for me, actually, your point, Tim, as well as Sarah, about the extent to which we have taken this for granted, but actually some of those mantras, like the rules-based system is most beneficial for small players. You're absolutely right. It actually matters for everybody, and that's why this is such a essential issue for us to try and solve and put that together. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I wanted just to thank so much all of you for taking part, but particularly Jennifer, Skyping in. I know it must be late in US time. So, thank you so much. It's just, the people in the room today are all, either trade experts themselves or people like myself who work in a trade-focused role. And so, to us, this is, essential and really important issues, but it's also, an opportunity to kind of geek out on a topic that is so incredibly important to all of us. So.